everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. We are continuing with the trig unit 6.3, but 6.3 notes 2. We're continuing with graphing. This time we're going to look at graphing cosine. So we're going to first start with the parent function, okay, like we did the other day with sine. We can look at our cosine, which is our x values, okay? And if we look at the unit circle, cosine of 0 is 1, so it's definitely different than our sine function, okay? Is 1. Cosine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. Cosine of 3 pi over 4 is negative root 2 over 2. 2 over 2, and then cosine of pi is negative 1. Cosine of 5 pi over 4 is negative root 2 over 2. Cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0. Cosine of 7 pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. And finishing up at cosine of 2 pi, we're back at 1. Okay, so those are our values, that same ones that we started with sine. So we're going to complete the table below by simplifying root 2 over 2. So cosine of 0 was 1. Cosine of pi over 4. If I put that in my calculator, it's 0.707. Fill out the rest of the chart. Okay, so I filled out the rest of the chart, and all I did is took the values above and wrote them on a table of values and converted the root 2 over 2 to a decimal. So pi over 2, we're at 0, then 3 pi over 4, negative 0.707. Pi, we're at negative 1. 5 pi over 4, still negative 0.707. 3 pi over 2, we're at 0. 7 pi over 4, we're at 0.707. And 2 pi, we're back at 1. So this is different than the sine graph, where the sine graph started at the middle. The midline is still the same, it's the middle of your graph. But for cosine, we're starting at the highest point, which is 1. Then pi over 4, we're at 7.707. Pi over 2, we're at 0. 3 pi over 4, at negative 0.707. At pi, we're at the minimum of negative 1. 5 pi over 4, negative 0.707. 3 pi over 2, we're at 0. 7 pi over 4, and 2 pi, we're back at 1. So again, this is a little bit different. Sine, you start at the midline. Now cosine, you're starting at the maximum. So we are going to connect the points with a smooth curved line. And here's your graph connected. Again, midline 0. Okay, your amplitude, remember it's the distance from the midline to the max and midline to the min, which is 1. Okay, and the period, which is 1 full rotation. Since we started at the max, 1 full rotation ends at the max, which is at 2 pi. Okay, so remember when we get into transformations, we have A, which is our amplitude. B changes the period. D is moving the graph up or down, which is also our midline. So for these, next examples, we're going to find the amplitude, then sketch one period, which is going to be 2 pi. So our amplitude is in front, which is 1/4. So that means my highest point is going to be 1/4. My lowest point is -1/4 because my midline is still 0. We have not moved up or down. So if I was to graph it, the cosine graph always starts at the maximum, which is 1/4, unless it's a reflection. Pi over 2, we're at the midline. Pi, we're at the minimum. We're back at the midline. Then we finish off at the maximum for one full rotation. So, and then you connect. Okay, so that's what your cosine graph should look like. For number 2, cosine, the amplitude in front is 2, so that will be my highest point. And then -2 would be my lowest because the midline is still at 0 and it's the distance from the midline. So if we were to graph it, still starting at the max, then we're at the midline, then we're at the minimum, back to the midline, then we finish the rotation at the max. So again, we connect, and we have our cosine graph. Okay. In number 3, we have a negative. So what does that mean? A negative again is the reflection. Okay. And our amplitude is 3. So we have the highest point of 3. Okay, so we have our amplitude of 3, -3. Our midline is at 0. Okay, now when we graph this, since it's a reflection, instead of starting at the maximum, we're starting at the minimum. Okay, at -3. Then we go to the midline at pi over 2. Then we go to the max at pi, 3 pi over 2. Set midline, 2 pi, you're at the minimum. So now we want to connect these points, and it's a reflection. Okay, so now when we have a vertical shift, D, our midline, as we know, is going to change. So our midline is at 3. So we draw our midline at 3. Our amplitude, there's a 1 in front, so 1 above, which is 4, 1 below, which is 2. Now, cosine, again, we start at the maximum. Then we're at the midline. We're at the minimum, midline, back to the max. Okay, so you guys are familiar with this. Stop the video and try 2 and 3, and then we'll check the answers. Okay, so the next 2 examples for number 2, our midline is -1, our amplitude is 1, so 1 above and 1 below. Cosine, we start at the max, so at 0. Pi over 2, we're at -1. Pi, we're at the minimum of -2. Then we're back at the midline, then at the maximum. For number 3, we are at -1/2. So you add 1 above, subtract 1 below, and we have our cosine graph. Okay, so now we're going to have both of them together, the amplitude and the midline. So our midline here is 1. Our amplitude is 1. So we have 2 above, and it would be at 0. Our midline is at 1, but this is a reflection. So we're going to start at the minimum, which is 0. Pi over 2, we're at the midline. Pi, we're at the maximum. 3 pi over 2, we're at the midline. 2 pi at the minimum. And then you connect. Okay, so we're going to try number 2. We have 2 cosine of x at -2. So our midline is at -2. And our amplitude is 2. So we count from -2, 1, 2. We are at 0. From -2, we count down or subtract. 1, 2. We're at -4. Midline at -2. Okay, now we graph. So we're at our maximum of cosine, which is at 0. Then we're back at our midline. Then we are at the minimum, midline, back to the max. And then we connect these points. Okay, so pause the video and try number 3. Okay, so for number 3, our midline was 2 and our amplitude was 1/3. So you add 1/3 and end up getting 7/3 or 2.333 repeating. If you subtract 1/3, you have 5/3, which is 1.66667. Okay, so for number 3, hopefully all of you got that. Now we're moving on to, again, find the period, meaning one full rotation or one cycle. So remember that the period formula is P equals 2 pi over B, which means that's the number in front of x. So if we look at number 1, 2 pi over 2 gives me pi. So one full rotation is going to take pi units. Now, here's another trick to figure out the increments. If you divide by 4, then you just add 1/4 every single time. Another way you can have pi divide by 2, and that's where you get pi over 2. Divide pi over 2 by 2, and you get pi over 4. Then you take pi over 4 and multiply by 3 and get 3 pi over 4. So you could do it this way, or if you take your period, divide by 4, just add 1/4 every single time. Either way, you'll get the same answer. So our amplitude is 1. So 1 and -1. Our midline is at 0. We start at the highest point at 1. Pi over 4, we're at our midline. Pi over 2, we're at -1. 3 pi over 4 at our midline, and pi, we are at the maximum. So if we connect these, we have our sine graph, cosine graph, excuse me. We have our cosine graph. So let's look at number 2. Okay, we have the period equals 2 pi over 1/4. So you multiply both sides by 4 over 1, to get 8 pi. So if we have 8 pi, oops, divide by 2, we get 4 pi. Take 4 pi, divide by 2, get 2 pi, 2 pi, multiply by 3, we get 6 pi. And you would still get the same thing if you did 8 pi divided by 4 to get 2 pi, and that means you're going up every 2 pi units. Okay, our amplitude is 1, so 1 and -1. Our midline is at 0. Start at the maximum point. Okay, and when you end at the maximum point, you have completed one full rotation. Okay, try number 3, and then we'll check the answers. Okay, for number 3, we should have gotten a period of 2 pi divided by 3. And to find the increments, if you do 2 pi divided by 3 and divide by 2, you get pi over 3. So cut it in half. And then pi over 3 divided by 2 gives you pi over 6. And then pi over 6 times 3 gets 3 pi over 6, which gives you pi over 2. So we change the period in this section. Okay. Now we're going to try it all together with the amplitude changing and the period changing. So first let's find the period here, which is 2 pi over 2, which gives you pi. Okay, so that's pi units, 1 full rotation, divide by 2, pi over 2, divide by 2, pi over 4, multiply by 3, 3 pi over 4. Okay, our amplitude is 1. However, it's negative, meaning it's going to be a reflection. So our midline is at 0, but instead of starting at the maximum, we're starting at the minimum. Minimum, midline, maximum, midline, minimum. Okay, and that completes your graph. So pause the video and try number 2. Okay, for number 2, you should have gotten a period of 4 pi, 2 pi divided by 1/2, multiply both sides by 2, top and bottom by 2, excuse me, you get 4 pi, divide by 2, you get 2 pi, divide 2 pi by 2, you get pi, multiply pi by 3, you get 3 pi. Or you could have done 4 pi divided by 4 to get pi, and you just add pi units each time. Your amplitude was 3, not a reflection, so you start at the maximum, midline, minimum, midline, maximum. Okay, so the next part here is we're writing an equation for sinusoidal functions, which are the two that we've been doing. Sine, they could either be a sine graph or cosine graph. Now, when you're looking at these graphs, okay, we're only seeing one rotation. Okay, we're only seeing one rotation of this. However, this continues to go on and on. So some of these graphs that you will see will look like they could be cosine graphs or sine graphs. So remember, this keeps going in either direction. So what we're going to do to tell the difference between sine and cosine, we're going to use the y-axis, okay, to determine if it is sine or cosine. So we use the y-axis. Now, if it's a cosine graph, if it's cosine, since we just finished that, and you look at the y-axis, you're either starting at the maximum and ending at the maximum, or you're starting at the minimum and ending. Oops, let me just redo that. Okay, or you're starting at the minimum and ending at the minimum. For sine graphs, remember you're starting at the midline, go to the maximum, minimum, and you finish at the midline. If it's negative, you're still starting at the middle or the midline. Now you're going to your minimum, to your max, back at your middle. So cosine starts at the max or the min, sine, no matter what, if it's positive or negative, you're starting at the middle. Okay, then you want to determine the period, so how long one cycle takes. So if we're starting at the maximum, we have to see how long it will take to get to the other maximum. Then we have to work backwards to find our b value. So if we look at this first example, again, we're using the y-axis, okay, to help us. We're using the y-axis to help us. Draw a little line here. Okay, well here we're starting at the minimum. So what would that be? Sine or cosine? Well, it's going to be cosine. Okay, now there's a few pieces we need to figure out. So we count from the minimum to the maximum. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Half of 6 is 3. So we count 1, 2, 3. Negative 1 is our D value, which is our minimum, midline, excuse me, because there's 3 below and 3 above. So we know our midline's negative 1. Well, then our amplitude is 3. Now, will this amplitude be positive or negative? Well, since we're starting at the minimum, it's going to be negative. So now we have to see when it reaches the minimum again, which is here at 2 pi. Well, if we need to find that b value, we are working backwards. So we take, okay, we know the period's 2 pi, and we know the formula for period is 2 pi divided by b. Well, we have to cross multiply. When we cross multiply, we end up getting 2 pi over 2 pi, which equals 1. Okay, so this would be 1 x. You don't have to include the 1, but just to show you. So you've shown that we could decipher between cosine and sine by starting from the y-axis. Okay, if you start at the minimum or the max, you have a cosine graph. If you start at the middle, then you have a sine graph. So example 2, again, we're going to use the y-axis. Okay, and here again, we're starting at the minimum. So this must be a cosine graph. Okay, now if you look, there's 3 units below, 3 units above. So they have the same max and min. One's positive, one's negative. So therefore, my D value, my midline, is going to be 0. You could just include 0 if you want, or you don't need to, but just to show you. So our amplitude is 3. Since it's a reflection, we tack on the negative. Now, when do we reach the minimum again? 4 pi. So we know 4 pi is our period, and we need to find out the b value. So when we cross multiply, 4 pi times b equals 2 pi divided by 4 pi. Okay, pi's cancel, so your b value equals 1/2. Okay, so it's 1/2 x. Okay, so this equation is y equals negative 3 cosine of 1/2 x plus 0. Okay, now we're looking at example 3. Well, same thing here. Use the y-axis to help you determine. Well, here again, we're starting at the minimum. So this is cosine, cosine again. Okay, and the amplitude is 2. Okay, same distance, so therefore the midline is at 0. Okay, and this is another reflection, so negative in front. Okay, so when do we hit one full rotation? At 4 pi over 3. So this is a little bit different because you don't see pi units in the period. So in order to find b, we take 4 over 3, excuse me, equals 2 pi over b. Cross multiply, we have 4b equals 6 pi divided by 4. We get 6 pi over 4, which reduces to 3 pi over 2. And again, we have not seen this where there's pi as a, in for the b value, but it is possible, especially if you have your x-axis coordinates as whole numbers or fractions for real numbers instead of using pi. So you could possibly see this. So we have 3 pi over 2 x, and our midline is just 0. So that would be your equation for example 3. Okay, so for example 4, we have, if we start at the y-axis again, this is where it's starting is not at the maximum. Okay, it's actually at the middle, which is our midline. So therefore, this is a sine graph. And plus 3. I'm going to quickly erase this so we don't get confused. Okay, so now if we look, our amplitude is 1, okay, because the distance from the midline to the max, midline to the min is 1. Now we have to find the period, which is when do we reach the middle again? We reach the middle again at pi units. So again, we take pi equals 2 pi over b, cross multiply, and you will see b equals 2. So you have 2 times x. So that concludes finding your equations, okay, from a graph, as well as graphing sine and cosine with transformations. So we have one more little thing to do in trig, and that will be it for the trig unit. So your homework is to finish the 6.3 practice, the cosine graphs, and figuring out the graphs at the bottom. And that's all. All right, take care.